We good? Can you hear me? Okay. Morning, everyone. Welcome to the Extending the Core to Your Court session on accountability and court performance. My name's Kathy Griffin. I'm the chair of the core committee for NACM. I'm also on the NACM board as secretary treasurer. And I would like to introduce Stephanie Hess, who is, as she's told you this morning in the plenary, she's immediate past president of NACM. She serves on the National Center for State Court Faculty Board. She is currently the interim administrative director of the Supreme Court of Ohio. Her bio's on our app. I don't want to take the whole hour to read her bio. I had the privilege of serving on the board at the same time as Stephanie's presidency. So Stephanie's great. You're going to enjoy the course. I'd encourage you to look at the NACM core competency itself. She actually has it as a handout on the app as well. The PowerPoint is on the app, and the competency itself is one of the attachments on the app for this course. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie. I'm going to be at the back of the room, and this is live streamed and recorded both. So if there's a question, I'm going to run to you with the microphone. We'd like it to be on the mic so it's recorded. So, thank you.
Great, thanks, Kathy. So the core that Kathy was talking about that's on the app looks like this. So it is rather extensive. And for those of you that don't know, a number of years ago, we revised the core competencies and came up with the core that we have now. And one of the new competencies was court performance and accountability. So how many of you have taken the ICM class? Several of you. Have you taken it recently, or did you take it before the last iteration? Before? So this is a little bit different. So the ICM classes were largely modeled after the core competencies from NACM. So when we revised the core competencies and came up with the core, the National Center decided to revamp the ICM courses as well to more closely align with the work that we're doing with the core. So the new court performance module through ICM is now also accountability and court performance too. So it's a little bit different than it used to be in the past. I teach that course, which you know is probably, it's 2.5 days, right? So taking 2.5 days and taking the big core taking the core accountability course and squishing it into an hour, a little bit of a challenge. So bear with me. We're not going to get too deep into the weeds here, but I do want to give you all an opportunity to kind of share some stories, because I think one of the most valuable things that you can take away from NACM is making those connections with your peers in other courts, right? Like Teresa was saying earlier this morning when she accepted her award, the collaboration is one of the best things about the work that we do. So I want to give you all some opportunity to talk a little bit about what you're doing in your courts and what challenges you're facing. But let's kind of jump right in. We're going to talk a little bit about the benefits, what to measure, how to measure, what to do after the measuring's done. So kind of touching on the whole scope of performance management. So before we do that, the history. So did you know that the first time standards were actually created by the ABA back in 1976? So do you all have time standards in your states, in your courts? Some of you do, some of you don't. So that's a big step, right, is getting time standards, particularly when you're talking to judges, court administrators, and clerks. We're going to talk a little bit about court culture and whether or not you're ready to make that change. But so since 1976, the ABA has been saying, at a minimum, courts should be doing time standards. And then you see, I know it's hard to see in here, but you've got the PowerPoint in the app as well. But if you go along the continuum, so the trial court performance standards were established by the National Center back in 1990. Do you all remember that? Do you remember those two big binders that were established by the National Center? There was something like 22 standards and 68 measures or something, right? I just remember lugging around these two huge binders. So that was kind of the first iteration of court performance management and measurement, right? Those two big binders. And then we said, wait a second, this is a little unwieldy. We had some courts that were trying to do all 68 measures, which to me seems crazy, right? So we decided we need to whittle this down a little bit. The National Center came up with the 10 Court Tools, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And that was done in 2005. And since then, there have been a number of other items that have come along: High Performance Court Framework, the International Framework, and then in 2011, COSCA, which is the Conference of State Court Administrators, and NACM, along with the National Center, got together and revised those ABA time standards, so updated those. They've since then created appellate time standards. So a lot has happened in the history of performance management, right? But let's talk a little bit about why do we even care? Why are we even measuring? So this kind of goes from the top level to more granular. So of course, when we're talking about public trust and confidence, a lot of times the public is asking us, why are you doing what you're doing? Do you know what you're doing is effective? Particularly now when we're doing a lot of problem-solving courts, do we know what we're doing in those problem-solving courts is actually doing what we thought it was going to? Is it getting the job done? So we need to do some performance measurement to check and make sure and be accountable back to the public to say, we're spending the taxpayers' dollars on X, Y, and Z, and they're actually getting the results that we wanted them to get. So that accountability, productivity and efficiency, just from a management level, and we're going to talk a little bit about that as well, thinking about your staff and how efficient they are. I don't know, do any of you measure the work that your staff is doing? Like if you've got clerks, how many files are they working on an hour, so on and so forth? That's great. So just thinking about productivity and efficiency as well for that staff allocation. You know, back in the, I think about 2008 or so, when we had the foreclosure crisis, a lot of the courts in Ohio, where I'm from, kind of were blindsided because they didn't see that coming. They weren't paying enough attention to their caseloads. If they would have been paying attention to the caseloads, they could have tracked those foreclosure cases going up and up and up and up and up, and then maybe made some staffing reallocations to accommodate that. So thinking about if you're tracking your caseload and how that will impact your staffing too. So using that measurement to move staff around. And then funding requests. I know a lot of times our funding authorities will ask for some kind of performance measurement. Back in the 90s, my funding authority was doing measuring for results. And they wanted us to count everything from the number of phone calls to the number of people coming into the counter. And that was the first time that we had really started to think about counting those types of things. And it was kind of like one of those aha moments, thinking, oh my goodness, one, how are we going to make this happen? We're adding more work to our staff by asking them to count things. So how do you create a culture so that it's kind of woven into the work that you do every day so it's not too difficult to make happen? And then even more granular than funding requests, grant requirements. A lot of grantees now, or grantors now, are asking the grantees to provide back measurements. They're wanting to know, if I'm giving you the money to do X, Y, and Z, again, is it actually happening? So particularly when it comes to problem-solving courts, I know a lot of the grantors that are giving money for problem-solving courts are asking for recidivism information and so on to come back to them when they get those financial reports every quarter. So lots of different reasons why we measure. What else? Can you think of any other reasons? Maybe, you know, in Ohio, we have, all of our judges are elected by general election. So some of our judges have caught on to that and thought, well, I can measure things and I can use that on the campaign trail, right? I can provide the public with the statistics about my caseload, what's going on with the various case types, also thinking about time to disposition. Am I moving the cases quickly? So they can use that as kind of one of their speeches that they give on the campaign trail. Or if you're in a state where you're not, you don't have judges that are campaigning, a lot of times judges will go out and just do speeches to the Rotary. And having a good speech in your back pocket for the judge to go out and say, hey, this is what our caseload looks like, and this is how we're doing. Do you think of any other reasons why you would measure? We'll talk about a few of those as we go on. So thinking about the different types of things that you can measure, kind of baseline, you've got caseload report, right? So you've got a case management system, you can probably spit out all kinds of different caseload reports. So you can look and see how many cases are being filed, you can look and see how many trials are occurring, you can look and see how many cases are going to mediation. Hopefully you're using lots of different caseload reports out of your case management system. Transaction logs, and then moving on to qualitative, thinking about surveys. We're going to talk a little bit about in the Court Tools, there are a couple of different surveys that were created. So it's something that you can think about, maybe even doing focus groups too, and courtroom observation. I know in some of the larger urban courts, we've got some folks that will actually go in and sit in a courtroom and observe what's happening with the judge and with the staff, and then make recommendations to them on how they can streamline things in the courtroom, how they can better communicate so that the litigants and the defendants can understand what's happening in the courtroom a little bit better. So courtroom observation is also a really good way to kind of gather information. So you can go all the way from running reports to actually even doing some tally marks. We're going to talk about some ways you can count things just using a piece of paper and tally marks, and then even doing focus groups and surveys. Have any of you done surveys in your courts? A few of you? Have you had good luck doing that, or was it difficult? I'm sorry? You use them a lot. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you do?
Performance side or just surveys in general?
Both.
Well, surveys in general, of course, we use every 2 years we do our employee satisfaction survey, and we use those results to drive strategic planning and what we're doing with respect to our work inside the court as well as outside the court. So, and we also do external surveys as well of the public to get their opinion on how we're doing in certain areas. And so, again, using that information to drive in our planning process.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about the Court Tools as well. But yeah, surveys are always really helpful, right? You just never know what you're going to get with surveys. So you have to be prepared. Okay, so analyzing data. We heard from the speaker this morning, he was talking about, the double blind, placebo, whatnot. We don't have to go to all of that usually when we're analyzing our data, but longitudinal data, looking at data over a period of time. So instead of just taking a snapshot, if you've got the same data set that you can look at from month to month to month, year to year to year, and you can see how the cases or whatever it is that you're monitoring, how that's moving over time. So longitudinal data is one of my favorites because you get kind of the long perspective over a number of months or years. You can also measure against targets or standards. Maybe it's something that has been created internally, or maybe it's something that's been created externally. I know that in the state of Ohio, we have time standards that are statewide. So all of our judges have time standards that they have to meet for their different case types. But I have heard from the judges and the court administrators that a lot of times they're actually measuring beyond those time standards. The time standards that we've created in Ohio are pretty high level, and the court administrators said, you know what, we need more granular data. So they're targeting below the time standards because they want to know, they don't want to know when a case goes over the time standard, they want to know when it's halfway there, when it's 3/4 of the way there, when it's right up against that time standard, so then they know that they need to do something with those cases before they get to that time standard. So there's all kinds of different ways that you can actually collect the data, measure the data, and benchmark on the data as well. So, and then once you get the data collected, we've all seen charts like this, right? The pie charts. Isn't this horrific? When I see these, my eyes start crossing. So when you're thinking about the data, think about what your target audience is. If you gave this to one of your judges, they would just shake their head, right? And say, go back and create something that I can understand. I don't need a magnifying glass to see this. So think about who your target audience is, what you're going to use the data for, and then what the graphics need to look like so it can tell your story. There's all kinds of really cool tools that you can use online now to create really interesting graphics, like with the little bubbles. And, now they're doing infographics. Have you all seen those? Where there's like little pictures. And so if they're talking about 100 people, there'll be like 100 tiny little people. And it's pretty cool. It gives you a different visual to the information that you're presenting. So think a little bit about the graphics that you're using so that it speaks to the people that you're presenting to. It might be one thing if you've got a room full of finance people. A pie chart might be okay because that might be something that they're accustomed to looking at. Judges, maybe not so much. Staff. So once you start talking about collecting the data, I'm assuming at some point we'll talk about feeding the information back to staff. We'll talk about that a little bit in the Court Tools, but when you're feeding information back to staff, you need to make sure that you're creating it in a manner that the staff is going to understand as well, right? So you might have staff from all different kinds of disciplines that's in your court, and you need to make sure that you're creating something that is going to speak to all of them. So that's always really tricky. So moving from just collecting to doing what Ray was talking about and moving your management decisions based on the information that you have collected. So that's where we really want to be, right? That's kind of the sweet spot that we're looking for. We don't want to just collect data to collect data. We want to be able to collect the data to answer the questions that we have and then make management decisions based on the information that we have collected. So when you look at the other areas of the core, you'll see that there are actual other areas too that performance management and data is coming into play as well. Operations management, like Ray was talking about doing the employee satisfaction survey and then making operational decisions based on the feedback that's received. Workforce management, budget, fiscal management. So other areas of the core actually have some of those tags to performance management as well. So kind of keep that in mind, that we don't want to just kind of cordon off the performance management and say, okay, we're just going to use data collection for caseloads. There's so many other things that we can measure and manage using data collection, right? So keep that in mind as well. So Court Tools, let's talk a little bit about the Court Tools. Remember, the National Center created the Court Tools back in 2005. We talked about the surveys. So there are two surveys, Access and Fairness, which is number 1, and number 9, which is the Court Employee Satisfaction Survey. How many of you have done the Court Tool measures in your courts? A few of you. Do you do them every year? Or it's kind of one and done every year? Ongoing? A little bit of both. Okay. So for the surveys, a couple of things to note before you embark on doing the surveys if you haven't done them before. Like I mentioned before, make sure that you're prepared for whatever information that you get and that you actually react, right? So it's not enough just to do the survey and then say, okay, that's done. I'm going to put it on the shelf over here. You need to make sure that you're taking the information that you gathered, whether it's from your external customers or from your staff, and respond to that. One of the ways that we do that in Ohio is we oftentimes will assist courts doing both of the surveys, and we'll tell them, okay, we're going to collect this information. We're going to look and see what information we get back, and then we'll create some staff committees to respond to whatever we find in the survey. So a lot of times we'll have the staff committees that'll come back and say, okay, well, we reviewed the information that we collected from the Access and Fairness Survey, and we need more signage. Or maybe we need to hire some docents to kind of help people navigate the court system. If you've got a campus with a number of different buildings, maybe you need somebody to help move people between buildings. Or it could be that you're in an old historic courthouse, and when they come in the door, it's not readily apparent where the court is. Maybe they see signs for the auditor's office or for the treasurer's office, but where is the court? So maybe you need to work on the signage. So we've been able to create a lot of different ways where the staff can get involved and help with both the Access and Fairness Survey results as well as the Employee Satisfaction Survey. We found that a lot of the staff appreciate being involved in those committees and being able to provide some feedback on how the court can improve. So just kind of keep in the back of your mind that when you do those surveys, you've got a wealth of knowledge sitting right there with your staff, and make sure you use them when you get ready to implement changes based on the surveys. The next several, 2, 3, 4, 5, and even 6 to some extent, really focus on kind of the heart of what we do for case management, right? Clearance rates, time to disposition, age of active pending caseload, trial date certainty, and then to some extent, the file integrity too. So just thinking about the core mission of the court, right, is to do the cases and get the cases done in an expeditious manner while actually taking the time to do justice in each of them as well. So make sure we remember that we're not just about doing things fast, right? We want to make sure that each case is getting the level of justice that it needs. And using the court tools will help you to figure out where that is in the continuum. I'm not going to spend enough time to go over all of them. I imagine you probably are fairly familiar with the court tool measures and the terms that are used here. Clearance rates, just the number of cases coming in versus the number of cases going out. So are you clearing enough cases so that you're not developing a backlog? Time to disposition, just how long is it taking for you to get a case from filing to disposition? The age of active pending caseload helps you determine how old the bulk of your cases are. And you usually want to try to front load those so you don't have a bunch of really old cases. You've got most of your cases that are fairly young. Trial date certainty is one of my favorites. The court tool measures contemplates just looking at cases that actually go to trial. I like to kind of modify the trial date certainty court tool measure and use it for all kinds of other things. There was one court that we've done quite a bit of work with that actually was setting a gazillion pretrials for every case. It was not unusual to have 20 pretrials in one criminal case. So we said, we're going to take this court tool measure and we're going to modify it a little bit, and we're going to count the number of pretrials, we're going to count continuances, and then we're going to look at actual trial rates. So we were able to kind of give them an idea and say, your average criminal case is, a year and a half old, and there are 20 pretrials. Why is that? What are you doing with all these pretrials? How can we streamline it so that you don't have so many pretrials? Because it's just that churning, right? Not only is the defendant and the prosecutor and defense attorney coming back and forth every time you do a pretrial, but then you've got staff in either in the court or in the clerk's office that are sending out continuances and pretrial notices, and it's just so much work that is created. So I encourage you that if you do trial date certainty, kind of take that and modify it a little bit to meet your needs. As we know, there aren't a whole lot of trials that are happening in our courts these days. We're more looking at just dispositions, right? So counting those events that are happening so that you know what's going on with your caseload, not just necessarily focusing on trial date certainty, knowing that not a lot of trials actually happen. And reliability and integrity of the case files really impacts the work that's happening in the courtroom and even in chambers. Back when I worked for the trial court, we often had that mystery file that would come up missing, and everybody's pointing fingers, right, where it went. And so we'd go to the clerk's office and it said, oh, well, the staff attorney has it. So then you go to the staff attorney's office, and I don't have it, I don't know where it is. Check the judge's office. So then you go to the judge's chambers and you look on the judge's desk, and lo and behold, it was always in the staff attorney's office, like in the drawer on the bottom or something. So just thinking about how quickly you can access those files, and then once you get the files, are they complete? Does the judge have to flip through 10 gazillion different things to try to find what he or she is looking for? I know a lot of folks have gone to electronic files, which is great, but for those of us that are still doing some paper here and there, maybe even printing different items on different colored paper helps. I've heard a lot of courts that will print continuances like on green paper, so then the judge can just kind of flip through and see all the continuances and see how many times the prosecutor's grandmother has passed away over the course of one case. So there are all kinds of interesting things that you can do. Collection of monetary penalties. This one I have implemented several times, but I try to dissuade courts from doing it. While I understand the philosophy behind wanting to measure how well the court is collecting the monetary penalties, my fear when I work with courts is that once they start doing that, then the funding authority is going to focus on nothing but how much money are you collecting. And one of the things that we're trying to get the funding authorities to remember is courts are not revenue centers, right? So while it's important that our judgments are being enforced, it is equally, if not more important, that we're not funding the government on the backs of the people that are coming before the court. So I caution you, if you're going to use the collection of monetary penalties, to kind of think very carefully and think about how that's being, how the information is being collected, how it's being used, and then how that's being presented, particularly if there are funding authorities around. Effective use of jurors is always a really good one for those of you that have jury trials in your courts. Just trying to figure out how many jurors are you summonsing, how many of those are you using, how many are actually coming in and they end up sitting in the jury room waiting to be called upstairs, and then the case ends up pleading at the last minute or a settlement happens. So just getting a really good idea of how you're using your jurors. We talked about the employee satisfaction survey, and then cost per case is number 10. Just trying to figure out if you can put a monetary amount on how much it costs to process a case in your court. That one I caution folks on as well, because it's hard to isolate the court costs when you've got so many other justice system partners that are actually part of the greater court kind of system. So it's difficult to kind of nail down, but it's a really good one if you can convince your judges to take a stab at it. So those are the court tool measures. So that was a lot, and I know that usually takes a lot longer to kind of explain and go through. But have any of you used these? Do you have issues with using them? Have you had any horror stories? Have you had any great successes that you want to share with your colleagues? Yes, ma'am. Hang on just one second. Let Kathy get she's running.
I work for the Administrative Office of Courts here in Arkansas, and I work under the Office of Research, Justice, and Statistics.
Okay.
So a lot of what my colleagues and I do, we take the measures 2 through 6, and we have a database. We have a software that sits on top of our database that pulls all of this information out. So we go out and we educate judges on clearance rate, and none of them wants to be at the bottom of the list with their clearance rate.
Right.
So then they get interested in their age of active pending caseload and start working those cases in order to bring their clearance rates up. So we measure a lot of what you have up there.
That's great. And so the judges, do they receive the education well? I mean, are they excited about understanding about the measures?
Some do and some don't.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, it just depends on, but we've created a lot of dialogue where it used to be that the case file was just in the clerk's office in a drawer. Now with transparency and everything out there, they've become a lot more interested in it.
Good. It's baby steps, right? Yeah. I saw another hand somewhere.
We use most of these core tools in our court, but we do kind of what you were talking about with I think you were talking about adjusting the trial date certainty. We adjust almost all of them to fit our needs. So the time to disposition meets our statutory goals and timelines. And our reliability and integrity of case files, we don't look at the time to call up a case because we are all electronic, but we look at the data integrity of the case. So we do that. And as a matter of fact, I will be presenting on just that, how to adjust these court tools at the annual conference. So if anybody wants to come back and hear more about that.
That was a great pitch.
Thank you.
So you can learn more about the core tools, the annual conference in Las Vegas in July. What else?
I'll add in, in Michigan, we have a trial court performance measure committee with our state court that I'm on the committee. And we use these as each year we push out different ones, make it mandatory for all the courts to do. So the employee satisfaction survey, we've used the public trust survey. That's one that we've implemented. That's at first was an annual survey that all the courts had to do. Now they make it every other year because we try and implement more. And we've also used some of these. I also sit on the Judicial Resource Committee with the state, and we use this to determine judicial need. So.
Great. Yeah, so thinking about judicial need, so weighted caseloads. Who else has done a weighted caseload study? I know Michigan, it was an infamous study, maybe? It created a lot of buzz, I think. So the weighted caseload study is actually done by the National Center as well. And for those of you that don't know what that is, and Kathy, I don't know if you want to jump in, but we haven't done it in Ohio. We tried to get some support amongst the judges to do it in Ohio and weren't quite successful. So we'll try that again one of these days. But so what happens is they ask the judges and the magistrates to kind of take note of how much time it takes them to do various things, various case types, various, how long does it take you to do a plea? Does one judge usually take 45 minutes to do a plea and another judge takes 10 minutes? So they ask the judges and the court staff to collect all this data over a period of time about how much time it takes them to do certain things. And they figure out that if you've got a caseload of 500 cases and 400 of them are criminal cases, then they can weight how much time you're spending on those criminal cases. And they can also talk a little bit about judicial need. So thinking about the judicial officers as being your hottest commodity in your court, right? So making sure that you're using your judicial officers the most efficient way possible. So looking at how many judges do you need to have in your court based on your case types. So if you've got a really heavy criminal docket, or maybe you've got a traffic docket that are mostly, although you've got a lot of numbers, most of those are actually just violations bureau cases that are just being paid either online or at a window, and the judge never has to even see those. So obviously, even though you've got a really high caseload in that instance, your need for judicial involvement is probably pretty low because a lot of those cases are just resolved by payment, right? So the weighted caseload is another way to kind of measure what we're doing, how you're using your judges, how much time each of the cases are taking to get done. So that was it. That was a good tip. Thanks, Kathy. So other management tools, I mentioned earlier that the National Center kind of went beyond when they created the court tools, and they created appellate court tools. There's also some for A&D cases, problem-solving courts. So how many of you have heard about the bucket list that was used in Scottsdale? Scottsdale, right? The bucket list. So Janet Cornell, who is a strong NACM supporter, she's a past president of NACM as well, kind of created this bucket kind of idea, thinking about her staff and the items that her staff were doing in their day-to-day functions. So trying to figure out who's doing what, and thinking back to what you're collecting and how that's driving your management decisions. So they created this bucket project where they had staff kind of tally what all they were doing. So if you had somebody that was answering phones, how many phone calls did they take every day? How long were the phone calls? And then thinking about, too, if you've got someone that's working in a file room, how many files are they touching each day? How many items are, how many filings are they accepting? Just having your staff kind of count everything that they're doing, which is tedious and very time consuming. But in the end, you get a really good snapshot of what your staff are doing, what they're spending their time on, and then you can make management decisions based on that. For instance, if you've got someone, like in our court philosophy is someone should always, if they're calling our court, they should always be able to speak to a real person. So we don't have an automated system when you call the Supreme Court of Ohio. You get a real person on the other end of the phone that says, how can I help you? How can I direct your call? And then we'll send the calls out. That works well for the Supreme Court of Ohio because we're the court of last resort. We don't have a whole lot of phone calls that are coming in, so we're still able to provide that kind of personal touch. But in a really busy municipal court, probably not realistic, right? So by doing that kind of bucket analysis and checking to see, how many phone calls are the staff taking, and then that aha moment, looking at those statistics and saying, we really need to get one of the automated telephone systems. The one that you call in and press this for this and press number 2 for whatever else. So thinking a little bit about how you can just kind of collect those mundane little everyday items, if you measure those, and that can actually help you kind of figure out what you can do from a management level to make life easier for your staff and increase your efficiencies. Have any of you done any of those kind of time studies before with your staff? Nope. It's a lot to kind of think about, right? And to figure out how you can collect that information without burdening your staff too much, because the last thing you want to do is take an overworked staff and add a bunch more on top. But if you can do it in a manner that's not too difficult to collect and for a short enough period of time that's going to get you good data, but not going to be too burdensome, it's handy to do. What else are you all measuring? Does anybody measure any probation information? Yes? What kind of stuff do you measure? Do you mind telling? Hang on just one second. Microphone.
Hi. We measure caseload numbers, how long we'll have somebody pretrial versus post-adjudication, demographics, what type of activities people are required to attend, and then how many violations and results of violations, those sort of things, early closures.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Do you still do home visits? No. I've worked with a couple of courts where we were trying to figure out the effectiveness of doing the home visits, balancing the effectiveness of a home visit versus the danger of doing a home visit. And so we did some counting on that, and that was interesting. What else? What else are you measuring? Yes, ma'am.
Well, we measure, I work in language access, and so we measure number of service events, how long they last, oftentimes the type of case, and the like, and whether it's covered by staff and what language. So we
language.
get a lot of metrics with regard to language access.
That's great. Who's collecting information about self-represented litigants? That's $1 million question, right? Everybody wants to know how many people are coming into the court that don't have an attorney.
We're capturing it in our database.
You capture it? Is that helpful, knowing how many people you have? Have you changed how you do business at all?
I don't think so.
No?
We started capturing it maybe a year or so ago.
Okay.
So I'm not sure that we're using it, that we're using it yet.
So it's
but
pretty
we
new.
are-
You just
it's
started
pretty-
capturing
right.
about a year ago. Okay.
We also collect and measure,
Can you hold?
I'm sorry.
there
We
you-
also collect and measure security information about, and not just how many people are coming to court without an attorney, how many people are coming in our doors every day, how many security incidents do we have, how many times are we taking weapons off people. So we do that every week to monitor what we're doing because we have multiple locations. So
We measure language. In addition, and we also measure domestic violence events, and we measure, we measure a lot of stuff.
Measuring.
Yeah, that's good. So security, thinking about measuring how many people are actually being screened, how many events are happening. That really, I imagine, would help drive operational decisions from a management perspective on where you're putting your security staff, right?
Exactly.
What else? So I know we have at least one judge in the room. Do we have more than one? I hate to put the judge on the spot. I'm curious to know, from a judge's perspective, what kind of information do you want to help make your life easier or to make decisions? Have you thought about that at all?
I think you got the impression question. I was a judge.
Oh, you're not a judge?
I'm a trial court administrator.
Oh, okay.
So I work with the judge.
Oh, okay.
And
But you have,
what was your question again?
what the judges want to know.
We've started getting monthly and quarterly reports of our age to disposition and those kind of rates and that kind of thing. And my judge is very wanting to get right on top of them. So I have now touched every single criminal case. And she's trying to come up with different ways to find out why this case is still lingering out there. Is it a coding issue because our systems are still fairly new? Or is it really, hanging out there still? And how to push it along. She wants to know everything. I mean, I've even pulled in the last couple of weeks information about what children she has that have been parental rights terminated and are still on the adoption list, and what kind of, or how many children she still has that are now in that, what we refer to as APLA, which is where they are basically are going to live on their own, and we're teaching them how to live on their own and, get an apartment and that kind of thing, and they're not going back home to their parents.
Mm-hmm.
So she wants to track everything.
That's great.
Yeah, but I'm having trouble figuring out. I'm having trouble trying to figure out how to stay on top of it, and how to take the information that I get and make it into a useful. I end up making Excel spreadsheets from the downloads from our Tableau system, and I can't stay on top of it.
Yeah.
But and then we have other judges that are aging out this term, and they just won't even touch the computer whatsoever.
Yes.
So that's why I said earlier that we have some that accept it and some that don't, because mine is all over it.
Yeah.
And
Others not so much. Yeah, we do have kind of a great divide right now, right? Because we've got some folks that are still on the bench that did not grow up with technology, did not grow up having that kind of information at their fingertips. So they might not be quite as comfortable, right? But then you've got the newer judges that are coming on that, have been immersed in technology and data for a number of years and want more. Yeah, so that's a really interesting conundrum that you're in. She keeps asking for more and more information. I kind of had a similar experience when I worked in a trial court. We had the time standards that I had mentioned earlier, and each month, as the month ended, the judge would want to know what cases do I have that are pending past the time standard and why. So it's not enough just to give her the list. I also needed to know, in my mind, why each of them was still there and what we needed to do to move them on. So she was very hands-on like that too, which was interesting because the judge that I had before wasn't like that. So it was really a culture shift for me to kind of retrain my brain and say, okay, this is what I need to do to be prepared. I know the end of the month is coming and she's going to ask these questions and I need to have answers, right? So trying to figure out what you need to do to get to that point. What else? We have started in our court. Ours is the highest appellate court in Ohio. So you think Court of Appeals, we've got the appellate court tools, but it's kind of like, how much can you really count? We actually we created our own case management system. Mind you, we don't have a huge caseload, but we created our own case management system and it tracks phases. So we know how long it's taking for justices to do the opinion drafting. We know how long it's taking for the opinions to be edited. We know how long it's taking for opinions to get recirculated. Any point in time on the continuum of a caseload, we've got some stage gates in there, so we know how long they're taking. And we're just now, our case management system is relatively new. We've had it for a couple of years, but we're now getting this longitudinal data that we're able to feed back to the court. And so they're actually making changes on how they're handling their caseload based on the information that they're getting back, which from my standpoint as a court administrator is so gratifying because that's exactly what you want to happen, right? You want to be able to collect this information and give it to your judges, or in my case, justices, and then they react to it and make some tweaks to make the caseload to move along a little bit more efficiently. So that's kind of like, oh, yay, it's actually happening the way it's supposed to happen, right? Did anybody else get those wins that you're just like, oh, this is why I do what I do? It's like what the speaker was talking about this morning. You got 5 seconds to say, right? Okay. So for those of you that are more visual learners, I have a couple of schematics that are in here so that you can kind of see, and I know this is really hard to see on the screen, but you've got it in your materials as well on the app. So just looking at using the measures to actually drive the operations and the management of the court. Looking at the expectations, the effectiveness, and addressing those efficiencies or inefficiencies kind of up there at the top level and then flowing down. Thinking about the information that you get and how, once you get the data back out, after you've figured out what you're going to collect, you get it collected, you get it back out, and you've got this blizzard of numbers, and now what do you do, right? So trying to diagnose the results of those, the measures that you've done, and figuring out what does it mean. And then we talked a little bit before about organizing that data and communicating it back out, whether you're communicating it to staff or judges. And then actually integrating all of that information into your system orientation. So, like I said before, when we were talking about the bucket list and we were thinking about having staff kind of tally what they do, trying to figure out how you can implement that and then get it into your court culture. So anybody coming in the door, it's just expected. This is what you're going to do. This is how we do business. This is how we collect the information. And then this is how we make changes. So when you haven't been doing it and you try to do it, it is very painful, right? It can be very painful. But once you've started doing it and it becomes part of your everyday business, then it's just what you do. So trying to figure out how to get to that. So court culture. One of the things that's really important is just trying to figure out what is your court ready to do and what they're not. In Ohio, we still have a lot of court reporters. I know many states have gone like to all digital recordings. We still have a lot of court reporters in Ohio. So for me to walk into a room full of judges and to say, let's measure how long it's taking your court reporter to get the transcripts done, that would likely be a career-ending move for me. They might not appreciate that. Because in many courts, we've got a couple courts that pool their court reporters, but in many courts, the court reporter is still tied to a judge, right? And so that's their personal staff, and they don't want to be told how to deal with their personal staff. So trying to figure out, from a court culture perspective, what you can do and what you can't do, what you're ready to measure and what you're not. We just recently in Ohio, we don't have a statewide case management system, so we just recently rolled out, we used to do an annual report, which, speaking of blizzards of numbers, it was a blizzard of numbers, and it was just caseloads by county and by judge and whatnot. And we have now been able to make that into an electronic system using Tableau, and so we've got a dashboard that judges can get online and they can pull it up. And that has been a year, maybe a little bit more in the making, because we've gone out and we've talked to the judges over and over and over again and said, hey, this is coming. They knew that it was all available in the blizzard of numbers before, but I think they felt a little bit, it was more safe when it was a book that was a blizzard of numbers. But then when you put it online and it's graphics and you can immediately click and see how one court is doing against another court, it's a little bit of a different kind of feel to it. So we took our time and we talked to judges about it a lot. We went out and we did demonstrations and said, this is what it's going to look like. Here's what you're going to be able to do with it. And so far, we've just unveiled it and rolled it out. We haven't, the sky hasn't been falling. So I consider it a win. But I did have a judge that came up to me last week and said, I know for a fact that this court over here is making up their numbers, because there's no way that their numbers are better than my numbers. So then, of course, the answer to that is, Well, part of this process is data integrity. So garbage in, garbage out, right? So depending on how they're entering their information into their case management system, they may or may not be getting what they thought they wanted back out. Or they may be helping things along. But that's something that we'll have to look into. So knowing what your court culture is and what you're going to be able to get away with when you make that shift, that's really, really important. So if you look in the competency, there is a lot of information in there about court culture. There's been a lot of really good research that's been done by the National Center. So if you're interested in just court culture and how to shift using court culture, I encourage you to take a look at that. And knowing that you're going to fail, but that's going to make you better, right? So understanding that that failure is part of your success, that we've done this iteration, I now have this nice dashboard that all of the judges in the state can look at, and I've got one judge saying, nuh-uh, that information is not right. So it's a little bit of a hiccup, but we will get all the judges on board. So looking at this kind of quality cycle, this was created by the National Center as well. And you know, there's a lot of the National Center products that are embedded in the core throughout. And so I just wanted to make sure that I gave them credit where credit is due. So the high performance court framework, and this is basically just a graphic that reminds us that this is a continuous cycle, right? So if you look at the top, defining the problem. So you've got your problem, trying to figure out what you need to make happen, collecting the data, analyzing the data, and then taking the corrective action. But you'll see, after you take the corrective action, there's another little circle there, because you need to do continuous quality control, right? Even though you've measured, you can't just measure and walk away and say, okay, I've measured, I've tweaked this, and now I'm done. You need to keep going back and saying, okay, is this still working, right? So it's not just one and done. You have to make sure that it's still working before you can finalize things. And then even benchmarking every year so that you can have that longitudinal data so that you know that it's continuing to work the way you thought that it was going to. Right? Thinking a little bit again about probation stats, because I think a lot of times when we talk about performance management, we automatically go to kind of those caseload court tools, right? But let's think too about probation, pretrial. You know, pretrial right now is something that everybody is talking about, using risk assessment tools for pretrial services, trying to make sure that you're giving defendants the level of service that they need, not automatically just throwing people in jail, but where can we get them into services and treatment if they need it? Is anybody using any kind of measurement in their pretrial departments? Not for adults? No? What do you do in juvenile?
For juveniles, we're beginning to do pre-assessments or assessments for each juvenile. We're beginning that, so that's going to be a brand new start for most people. But I don't think we're doing that for for defendants.
Okay.
Adult defendants.
Okay.
We do a number of measurements with that, including the compliance rate of judicial officers to the actual risk assessment recommendation, which is something we've been trying to follow because we spend a lot of money and time going to these tools, and we've got to monitor how well our officers are using them. And we've used that data, by the way, to do some additional training because we found that there were some areas of misunderstanding. But we also, measure the compliance. Are they showing up when they're supposed to? Failure to appear and that kind of stuff. So, but we use a lot of measurements there.
Yeah, that's great. This is something that we're working on really hard in Ohio, is trying to effectuate some change on the pretrial spectrum. So we have a lot of courts that are using risk assessments, but not collecting a lot of data to go along with it. So like Ray was talking about, what is the compliance rate? Some would say, do you want the judge just blindly following the risk assessment tool? Or is that one of the things that they should take into consideration? So that's an ongoing discussion that we're having in Ohio. But then we've got folks from from other areas of the criminal justice system, folks that run bail companies, and so they've got a very big interest in where we're going with pretrial assessments as well. And tracking those failure to appears is a really big part of that. So Ray, you're doing the risk assessments both in adult and juvenile courts?
No, we're not doing it juvenile.
Not
yet.
juvenile, just
No,
adult?
Just adult. Oh, I'm sorry. Just kidding.
We've got microphones flying around here.
But, I don't have an answer to your question. I do know that, when we started and the compliance rate over judicial officers was really in the tank, it was, 25, 30%. They were, okay, this is what I'll do. It had a lot that had to do with understanding it a little bit better and better training, so we didn't, we may have missed the mark early on. But, I right now, and I can't tell you off the top of my head what the last report said, but we're in the 60% to 70% range where they're, okay, that makes sense to me, this is what I will do and follow the, but I wouldn't say 100, we're not looking for 100% compliance. That is not what we want discretion
Right.
with issues, but we also want some predictability and some transparency in what we're doing every time we, have an individual in front of them in our initial appearance court, so.
Anything else on pretrial assessments? So like Ray was talking about, they're constantly measuring how those are going with the risk assessments and doing education. So that might be part of the operational and management decisions that you'll make after you gather the information. Maybe there's more training that needs to happen, either for judges, for court staff, maybe both. So just a reminder of the NACM Cour as we kind of wind down here. So we have a separate site, nacmcore.org. So if you go to the Cour, you can get all this information from all of the core competencies that are on there. A lot of the core competencies actually have PowerPoint presentations that you can just pull off of there and use for training for your staff. You can certainly use any of the trainings that we have recorded at the NACM sessions. You can use those for your staff as well. So we encourage you to kind of incorporate the core into your training when you're bringing folks in. We do that a lot of times in Ohio. Especially if you have somebody that's never worked in the court system before, we'll use some of the core information to make them understand what the court system is all about and that public trust and confidence, transparency, and so on. So we encourage you to use this information. Any other closing comments? Oh, we've got one behind you.
The one point that I try to make when I'm teaching my course on budget and fiscal management, we talk about performance measurements is once you do a measurement and you determine what you need to correct, you need to measure it again to make sure it's effective. So while doing performance measurements are great, if you don't, one, do anything with that data, and two, measure again to make sure it's working and effective, it's not going to do you a whole lot of good.
Right. Yeah, so keep going back to that quality cycle. You have to keep measuring again. Anything else?
I have two comments. One, with the NACM Core, all the different competencies. If you're a NACM member and would like to serve on the core committee and you're real strong in one of these areas, part of our committee structure is we review each competency to keep it refreshed and renewed. And also, Stephanie was talking about the PowerPoints and the videos. They're on the NACM Core website, and they're under the resource tab. So, as the various committee members make PowerPoint presentations, I post them to the resource tab for everyone to use. And then on the second note, with regard to data, we're collecting data with the evaluation surveys. So go into the app and evaluate the survey.
That was a great segue.
Make sure you evaluate the great job that Stephanie did. Thank you.
Thank you all.